Thank you so much. So we are very happy to welcome Katya Bowers, who will be presenting her book, Writing Fear, Russian Realism and the Gothic. And Katya's discussant will be Katya Hokanson of University of Oregon. Please, Katya, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ilya, and thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to the 19V organizers for organizing the series. So today I'm going to talk about my book, Writing Fear, Russian Realism and the Gothic, which came out in April from University of Toronto Press. And I do not have a discount code today, but ACES is coming up, so there will be some kind of UTP discount code at that point. My book joins a number of works that have come out over the past 5 years that have substantially enhanced our understanding of the importance of Gothic literature for our field. In particular, and here I'm going to name some things that have recently come out, the 2018 Siege Forum on the topic of 19th century Ukrainian Gothic, the work of Svetlana Kris, 2 2019 special issues on Gothic from Canadian Slavonic papers and Russian literature that expand the analysis of the Gothic into the later Soviet and post-Soviet periods and engage with post-coloniality. And in 2020, Valeria Sobel's groundbreaking book on Empires, Gothic and the Imperial Russian Uncanny, which demonstrates the way writers use Gothic as a means to represent aspects of imperial context that inform their work. And I'm glad that my book has come out in such good company and that Gothic studies is becoming more established in our field. My book is a study of the Gothic's history within Russian realism. And in my talk today, I'm going to discuss Gothic literary history within the Russian context and the development of my argument, why realism's inclusion of the Gothic mode is surprising, and conversely, why realism's inclusion of the Gothic mode is not that surprising. And finally, I'll give a case study from my book that demonstrates what Gothic looks like within the bounds of realism and how it functions there. Often in Russian literary history, the story has been that, quote, as an explicit mode or worldview, the Gothic rarely appeared in the Russian pre-revolutionary literary tradition before the decadence of the symbolist period, end quote. And that is a quote from 2019. The prevalent narrative has been that Gothic fiction represents a curiosity, a brief period in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when a handful of writers produced generically derivative texts that was quickly overturned by Romanticism and the rise of the Romantic Fantastic. When we as Russian literary scholars think of what Gothic fiction means in the context of Russian literature, we think of a handful of authors who feature prominently in earlier studies of Russian Gothic by scholars like Simpson, Cornwell, and Polyakova and Tamarchenko. First and foremost, of course, Karamzin, who wrote the early Russian Gothic story Astropon Gom. And then there's the Gothic verse of Zhukovsky, the Gothic parodies of Somov, the Gothic prose of Bestuzhev-Marlinsky, the fantastic prose of Pushkin, Gogol, and Adoevsky, and arguably also Dostoevsky, and maybe also Chekhov's Chorny Monach. There are, of course, other examples of Gothic, but these works have formed a kind of Gothic canon in our field. This literary history, however, belies the rich tradition of Gothic writing that appeared on the Russian book market between 1792, when Clara Reeves' The Old English Baron, the first Gothic novel translated into Russian, appeared, and the end of the Gothic wave, so-called, in 1820, a period of frenzied Gothic translation and publication, which was studied extensively by Vatsuro. During this period, a significant number of Gothic novels were published in Russia, the majority of them in translation. Their popularity reflected the Gothic trend on the French book market, where Gothic novels, also majority in translation, were being published at a frenzied pace. One intriguing way, in fact, to gauge Gothic novels' popularity in Russia is by studying Anne Radcliffe's circulation. The English writer Anne Radcliffe was the most popular writer in Europe in the 1790s. Following the successes of her major novels, they're highlighted here, The Romance of the Forest, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and The Italian, she retired from public life. These 3 works were translated into multiple French editions and then into multiple Russian editions from the French. In 1802 alone, 7 editions of Radcliffe novels were published in Russia. However, not all of these were among Radcliffe's authored novels. In Russia, as in France, publishers added Radcliffe's name to books to ensure better sales. In 1802, in addition to Radcliffe's own works, 3 other works came out in her name. Among them, perhaps surprisingly, Matthew Lewis's influential and scandalous novel, The Monk. Radcliffe's fame persisted with new Radcliffe works like this one, which I put here because I particularly like the image and the title. new Radcliffe works being published under her name in Russia until 1820, and these works going into multiple editions afterward. Readers' memoirs give us a sense of Radcliffe's staying power. One memoirist, Yekaterina Sushkova, described finding some volumes by Anne Radcliffe on a shelf in her aunt's library and reading them. With what freezing of my heart I learned the theory of apparitions. Sometimes it seemed to me that I saw them. They caused me fear, but some kind of pleasant fear. Another, Mikhail Dmitriev, remembered the fashionable novels of the time were those of Mesdames de Genlis and Radcliffe. I didn't like the delicate works of the former as they always seemed saccharine, but my aunt shed a lot of sensitive tears over them. But the horrors and secrets of Madame Radcliffe fascinated me, like all the readers of that time. In 1863, and you all will probably have heard this quote before, Dostoevsky recalled having read her works read aloud to him as a child. Quote, on long winter evenings, I listened because I could not yet read, mouth agape and dying from delight and horror, as my parents read Anne Radcliffe's novels aloud to me. Then I would rave about them deliriously in my sleep. And here also you have a picture of the black veil scene from Radcliffe. And here I use Radcliffe as an example because her popularity, including works by other authors with Radcliffe's authorship misattributed, means that her name appears frequently in readers' memoirs, as well as in critical literature and booksellers' advertisements. Radcliffe, as a result, stands in as a general term for Gothic fiction. So if Gothic fiction was so popular, why did it disappear from Russian literary history? While Gothic fiction was popularly printed and read, it was panned by critics, both in Western Europe and in Russia. In Russian journals, Radcliffe's novels were often critiqued for being too violent or unnatural, and many of these critiques were gendered in nature. So here, for example, Vladimir Ismailov, using the pseudonym 000, comments on Radcliffe's unwomanly imagination. The Englishwoman Radcliffe dedicated her pen to the most terrifying fantasies, such as could be contrived not by the heart of a woman, but only by the imagination of the most passionate fanatic. Here, Ismailov is not discussing one work, but rather the body of pseudo-Radcliffe works published in Russia under her name, all of which he assumes to be written by Radcliffe. And a number of these, of course, were not necessarily written by women. In a similar vein, here we have Pyotr Makarov's review of The Monk, which he assumes to be written by Anne Radcliffe because it has her name on the cover. Gothic novels having no purpose, providing no true representation of society or people, revealing no new moral truths or new aspects of the human heart, do not have any use for any society and may be very damaging. And as a result of criticism like this, which was prevalent in Western Europe as well as in Russia, and here I'm just reading a few of them, but there were a lot of these published around this time. Although Gothic novels were popularly read, readers did not necessarily publicly admit to reading them. However, we see their popularity through parody. So Aras Somov in particular wrote several Gothic parodies that reveal what readers understood to be Gothic. Here from 1816 is the plan for a novel a la Radcliffe. And here I'll read the English, which was translated by Alessandra Tosi. Robbers, an underground prison, a tower, half a dozen owls, gleaming through ravines, the moon has risen, wolves are baying, the wind howls, awful dreams torment my heroes, fiery dragons, flying griffins from myth, fear, horror after them flows. There you have it, a novel a la Radcliffe, which speaks to the convention and the predictability of Gothic novels, although I think reading this, you wouldn't necessarily predict that many of these things appear in Gothic novels. Here from 1833, we have another excerpt, this time from the short story by Somov, Matushka i Synok. This is also Gothic parody, and again from the 1830s. So already this is pushing into the 19th century after the time when you would think Gothic novels had kind of faded away. Margarita Savishna passionately loved robbers' castles, the glint of daggers, the kidnapping of unfortunate heroines, and the secret packs of murderers under the windows of innocent victims doomed to be killed, meanwhile confined in a tiny room of the east or west tower. In a word, the imagine of Margarita Savishna, a woman of firm character and strong nerves, delighted only in novelistic blood, breathed with the atmosphere of the dungeon, fed on the smell of murder. So to say, she lived on terror. With parodic accounts like these and the accounts from memoirs I shared earlier, Gothic's prevalence and popularity during this time is pretty clear. But its history also prompts some reflection on questions like what becomes a part of literary history, which voices and texts are privileged and which are marginalized. Gothic fiction in Russia was a largely imported genre, both literally through translation and figuratively through imitation, that was predominantly associated with women writers like Radcliffe. It was popular and circulated for decades after the Gothic wave, but its reputation was one of lowbrow popular reading, and critics, with some exceptions, responded to it negatively. At a time when Russian literary circles were preoccupied with the aesthetic, status, and role of Russian literature, the fact that Gothic fiction was marginalized is not that surprising. And so now we see how Gothic disappeared, but my book argues that Gothic came to significantly influence literary realism. How did the Gothic genre come to be hidden within realism? People don't expect to see the Gothic in a realist novel. After all, realism is grounded in the everyday and aims to convey the experience of reality as closely as possible, while Gothic writing privileges the affective capacity of fear. The Gothic genre relies on the exaggeration of emotions such as fear, terror, and dread, anticipation of horrors, and moments of hesitation or uncertainty to create its fearful atmosphere. Employing the Gothic genre's literary devices within a realist text enables its author to access the narrative suspense that stems from the psychologies of fear, dread, and anxiety, and is a hallmark of the Gothic. Additionally, the Gothic genre provides a framework for addressing the aspects of human experience within narrative that are often concealed from others: guilt, transgression, fear, and anxiety. As I argue, realist writers found the Gothic's mobilization of fear within a narrative structure invaluable precisely because it enabled representation of affect and a connection with the reader through the shared experience of genre. Literary realism relies on artful devices in order to render reality in a way that believably resonates with readers' own lives. Jakobson identifies the inherent tension in the practice of realism as the ambiguity between the intent of the author and the experience of the reader. That is, between the author's attempt to portray life with verisimilitude and the reader's engagement with the literary form of the text. Indeed, realist works are frequently as much about the process of working out how to depict subjective reality as about its depiction. The openness of this self-conscious engagement with form enables literary realism to accommodate the Gothic. As Nancy Armstrong observes in How Novels Think, quote, "The familiar terrain of realism is the other side of the Gothic, as if the two existed in a mutually defining relationship," end quote. And here I should mention that the study of Gothic within realism is fairly well established in scholarship of Irish Gothic, for example, English Gothic, American Gothic, and even to some extent German Gothic. Gothic realism asks us to question what the limits of realism are, and part of that questioning was originated by Bakhtin and the limits placed on him by Soviet critics. Bakhtin coined the term Gothic realism in his dissertation F. Rabelais in the History of Realism, but the phrase does not appear in his published works. After his famously contentious dissertation defense, where the concept of Gothic realism was attacked, even the word realism was removed from the dissertation's title. To pass the defense, the examining committee required Bakhtin to remove all mention of Gothic realism from the dissertation because it was diametrically opposed to classical realism, that is, with the critical realism lauded by Soviet critics. Committee member Brodsky explicitly called classical realism, quote, "the antipode of this Gothic method," end quote, during the 1946 defense, stating, "According to your conception, there is one kind of realism, Gothic realism, and another, classical realism, and your preference is for the Gothic. I am completely unable to agree with Comrade Bakhtin. I am a supporter of classical realism." The particular inflexibility of the committee members on this point, and more broadly on what could be categorized as realist and what was outside the bounds, speaks to the particular time and place in which the defense took place. Stalinist Moscow, after all, was a dangerous place to assert views that went against the grain. Bakhtin revised the term to grotesque realism to pass his defense. At the defense, Bakhtin affirmed, quote, "I believe I've added a new page to the history of realism. I've enriched the history of realism. The whole of the Gothic is the history of realism." Gothic in this formulation refers to a concept that is related to the late 18th and early 19th century Gothic literary movement I've described thus far. Namely, it refers to a relationship to an imagined past. The first Gothic novel, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which was published in 1764, was subtitled A Gothic Story, which is where the name of the genre came from, precisely because a significant source of the anxiety within the novel was its Gothic, in air quotes, that is, its medieval setting. David Punter identifies, quote, "the Gothic's general opposition to realist aesthetics," end quote, in this imagined medievalism, but further observes that quote, time and time again, those writers who are referred to as Gothic turn out to be those who bring us up against the boundaries of the civilized, who demonstrate to us the relative nature of ethical and behavioral codes, and who place over against the conventional world a different sphere in which these codes operate at best in distorted forms, unquote. Similarly, Bakhtín's conceptualization of Gothic realism emerged from and was predicated on, quote, the idea of the eternal unfinalizedness, the unreadiness of the human being in the world, end quote. What Bakhtin advocates for here is a realism that accounts for all aspects of experience, including those that are concealed, repressed, or unarticulated. Literary realism striving for verisimilitude assumes a universality for aesthetic representation of the realia of the day today. However, in its emphasis on the unfinalizability of the human in the world, Bakhtin's concept of Gothic realism addresses the limitations of depicting any experience fully through art. For Bakhtin, the Gothic adds another layer to realist depiction that enables better representation of the subject. As Writing Fear demonstrates, Gothic poetics and realist form are inextricably connected. However, the Gothic elements present within realism that my book examines are invariably a degree or two removed from the original genre. Their migration into literary realism is a process of transmutation. In the realist text, Gothic may not appear cloaked in the guise of its familiar conventions. Nonetheless, the Gothic functionally provokes a similar response using mystery, transgression, and the depiction of psychological states. To see how Gothic convention is transformed in realist narrative, here we'll examine a classic Gothic trope, the discovery of a corpse in both modes. So here we have the discovery of a corpse from Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Beyond appeared a corpse stretched on a kind of low couch, which was crimsoned with human blood, as was the floor beneath. The features, deformed by death, were ghastly and horrible, and more than one livid wound appeared on the face. Emily, bending over the body, gazed for a moment with an eager, frenzied eye, but in the next, the lamp dropped from her hand and she fell senseless at the foot of the couch. Lurid details of deformed features, grisly lacerations, and the blood-drenched couch contribute to the scene's horror. Emily's immediate reaction, gazing transfixed and then fainting, also gives the reader a deepened sense of the tableau's inherent sensationalism. The description here lacks precise detail, however. The corpse's features are ghastly and horrible, but what they specifically look like is left to the reader's ideally overactive, because it's Gothic novel, imagination, reinforced by Emily's extreme reaction. Now, if we compare this scene with another passage, here from Tolstoy's Childhood, which also describes the reaction of an individual encountering a corpse, we get a sense of what Gothic looks like in a realist novel. And here, I'll read this in English. I climbed onto the chair to look at her face, but in its place appeared to me again the same pale yellow translucent object. I could not believe that it was her face. I began to stare at it transfixed and little by little began to recognize in it the familiar dear features. I shuddered with horror when I realized that this was she, but why were the closed eyes so sunken? Why was there that terrible paleness and on one cheek a blackish spot under the translucent skin? Why was the expression of the whole face so stern and cold? Why were the lips so pale and their shape so beautiful, so majestic and expressing such unearthly calm that a cold shiver ran down my spine and my hair stood on end when I gazed at it? I looked and felt that some kind of incomprehensible, irresistible power forced my eyes to that lifeless face. I did not take my eyes from it, yet my imagination drew me pictures brimming with life and happiness. I kept forgetting that the dead body lying before me, at which I blankly stared as at an object that had no connection with my memories, was her. Suddenly, I was struck by some feature in the pale face which drew my gaze. I remembered the dreadful reality, shuddered, and did not stop looking. Then dreams would replace reality again, and the consciousness of reality would again destroy the dreams. Finally, my imagination grew weary. It ceased to deceive me. The consciousness of reality also disappeared, and I completely lost all sense of myself. In the Radcliffe passage, the reader was left to imagine the corpse's features, but Tolstoy describes the corpse here in great detail. While an imagined horror can be a source of terror, in adding these specific, arguably naturalistic, but seemingly exaggerated details, as well as a sense of witnessing through first-person narration, Tolstoy induces his reader's sense of horror in a more visceral way. Even though the narrator explicitly describes the corpse from its sunken eyes and terrible paleness to the blackened spot under its translucent skin and the overall unearthliness of the object, some Gothic language underscores the horror of the scene, linking the protagonist's experience to the unknown. For example, the cold shiver that runs down the narrator's spine, the incomprehensible, irresistible power that forces the narrator to continue looking. These details echo Radcliffe's description of Emily taking in the corpse, quote, with an eager, frenzied eye, unquote. There, the use of the word eager suggests an inability to stop staring, even a kind of attraction, although Emily faints from shock and horror. Both reactions align with Kristeva's theory of objection, the uncanny experience of being able to reconcile a living being with a dead object, the anxious reminder of one's own mortality, and the perverse mingling of attraction and disgust this experience provokes. Neither protagonist can look away, even as they shudder. Both scenes end as the characters become emotionally overwhelmed and lose consciousness. While both passages describe fear's mechanism and function, drawing on Gothic conventions to depict characters' internal experiences, each treats the conventional scene very differently. In the Radcliffe passage, the deformed corpse's abhorrent image shocks Emily, who drew back the curtain revealing the corpse thinking that she would find her murdered aunt. While this corpse's identity was unknown, the depiction of Emily's terror in the situation results in reader and heroine sharing a common fear. The Tolstoy passage describes a child's growing realization that his loving mother has become a rotting corpse. His instinctive reaction combines with his questioning internal monologue to convey his fear to the reader. The reader does not feel afraid in the second passage, although the narrator's fear is comprehensible. Despite their authors' disparate writing styles, shared Gothic elements ensure that the two scenes resonate structurally and thematically. Tolstoy's use of Gothic tropes here is an example of what I would call Gothic realism. Gothic realism refers to moments when authors writing in what we recognize as a realist style turn to Gothic narrative devices, using the genre as a tool to articulate a facet of lived experience by effectively engaging readers. A sudden shift in tone directs these sometimes brief but deliberate moments to the reader. Examining Gothic realism shows how the Gothic functions within realist narrative as a model for depicting elements that do not mesh easily with everyday experience within the bounds of realism. Realist writers use the Gothic to highlight a specific transgression, trauma, or injustice, or to engage readers on a deeply affective level through the buildup of fear and suspense. The genre's power lies in the implicit relationship forged between writer, reader, and text, a relationship predicated on expectation and familiarity. As Carolyn R. Miller has observed, genre is a social act. In this sense, realist writers use Gothic narrative devices, tropes, and themes to harness the relationship of expectation and familiarity. These writers' engagement with the Gothic is thus not just a colorful way to describe the gloomy and macabre, but a deliberate appropriation of a system of reader expectation and generic convention. Writing Fear tells the story of the Gothic's role in Russian realism, from its beginnings as an outgrowth of and reaction to Romanticism to its eventual merger with modernism. The first half of the study, Gothic Migration, examines the way Russian writers began to use Gothic elements outside of Gothic works, engaging in a kind of literary alchemy, forging something new from the combination of distinctly different literary modes during the transition from Romanticism to realism. Gothic Migration examines the appropriation of the Gothic mode of writing into realism, its function and utility, and the specific ways in which it contributed to the realist palette. The second part of the book, Gothic Realism, provides a series of case studies that illuminate the function of the Gothic as a formal innovation within literary realism. The chapters in this section include studies of the way Gothic poetics, including plot, description, narrative force, and themes, shaped the form of the novel, enabled new forms of critical discourse, articulated moral paradigms, and reflected deep-seated cultural anxieties. And here I'm going to give an excerpt from one of these case studies, which will demonstrate what Gothic realism looks like in a realist text and how it functions. And for this, I've chosen my favorite chapter of the book, which examines Yevgenia Tur's 1851 novella Antonina as an example of Gothic subjectivity in the context of larger and later debates about the woman question. Tur was hailed as a major new literary talent when her first novel, The Mistake, Ashibka, was published in The Contemporary in 1849, the same year Jane Eyre was first published in Russia. Her follow-up novel, The Niece, Plemianitsa, appeared in 1851. While The Niece received mixed reviews, Part 3, which Tur published as a standalone novella called Antonina in the Journal of the Comet, Komieta, also in 1851, was universally lauded by critics. Ivan Turgenev famously wrote of it, quote, "These pages will remain in Russian literature," unquote. He praised the novella's ability to arouse deep sympathy, as well as the simple feeling and aspiring sincere passion of its form. The nearly simultaneous publication of Tur's and Bronte's works in Russia invited critical comparison. particularly as both writers were noted for their depiction of emotion. Like Jane Eyre, Antonina relates the first-person history of its heroine's neglected childhood, her experience working as a governess, the travails of separation from her true love, Michel, and her later marriage to another. Eventually, the novel takes Jane Eyre as a significant point of inspiration, not just in the experiences of Antonina, but also in its details. While Jane is orphaned and raised first by relatives who despise her and then in a boarding school, Antonina's orphanhood leaves her under the guardianship of not one, but two villainous step-parents. Antonina's abusive English stepfather is called Millcote, a reference to the village near Thornfield Hall, Millcote. Jane Eyre and Antonina are works about young women growing up and finding family, but in both, education is of primary importance. Both relate the histories of a governess for whom education enables a means of forging a life independent of a family. While the experience of education in each is a trial, Jane's experience at Lowood is harsh and deprived, while Antonina's education with her step-parents is characterized by abuse. Both heroines are grateful that education allows them to become self-sufficient. While Antonina and Jane Eyre are intertextually linked, the differences between Tor's novella and Bronte's novel are significant. The majority of Jane's time spent at Thornfield exposes her to the Gothic mysteries that are central to Bronte's novel, such as the brooding Edward Rochester and the famous madwoman in the attic. Jane's escape onto the Yorkshire moors brings her to family life with her cousins, but a mysterious voice calls her back to Rochester. This Gothic framework plays a significant role in Jane Eyre's structure and plot, but seems to be largely absent from Tor's novella. The majority of Antonina's time in her step-parents' care is spent planning her escape, first into service as a governess at a neighboring estate, and then into marriage with Michel. However, when her marriage plans are thwarted by Michel's weakness and inability to oppose his aunt's wishes, Antonina goes back into service. Eventually, she attracts the passionate love of an Italian businessman, but she cannot return his love. She marries him, and his jealous passion for her destroys their marriage. However, in the end, both Jane and Antonina find happiness in their children and in creating the kind of family structure that neither had growing up. Jane Eyre draws on the supernatural aspects of the Gothic tradition, while Antonina is more grounded in realism, but Tor's engagement with Gothic narrative devices constitutes another link with Bronte's novel. In an early scene, which also makes explicit the work's connection to Jane Eyre, Antonina has a transformative reading experience. The Gothically tinged scene conflates two episodes in Bronte's novel. The red glow of the fire and fear of ancestors' grim glares recalls the Gothic scene in which Jane, locked in the red room where her uncle died, becomes so overwrought and frightened that she faints. Crucially for both Jane and Antonina, Gothic exaggeration marks subjective experience, an emotional space that centers the young heroines in their stories as much as the first-person narration does. The Gothic description of the flickering fire's shadows and Antonina's fear echoed Jane's terrified hallucination of her dead uncle. Quote, and this is from Antonina, I see myself in a large, cold, towering room. It's dark all around me. A bright fireplace stands along one side. A dim candle burns in the corner. The glow of the fire, red and flickering, flares up and dies down, at times brightly illuminating objects in the room, casting their long, pale shadows on the lacquered parquet. Ancient portraits on the walls stare sternly from their darkened, once gilded frames. In the clear reflection of the frames, they exert a powerful grip on my childish sensibility and frighten me. I sit cowering in one corner of the room, completely alone. I'm cold and afraid. Quote. Whereas in Jane Eyre, a boarded reading leads to Jane's imprisonment in the Red Room, in Antonina, the terror of the Red Room is dispelled through the pleasure of reading. Quote, I sit down on a little bench that has been left next to the fire and sink into a reverie. Far off, like an echo, I hear shouting and children running in the next room. My stepmother can't leave them alone, so I'm completely safe. Then I surrender entirely to the pleasure of physical well-being. A book lies on my lap, my hands folded on it, but my eyes are fixed on the fire and follow the flickering flames. They're bending and curling. Suddenly, a harsh, robust voice resounds behind me. End quote. Antonina's escapist reading forges a safe space for her in the household where she can indulge in her rich inner life. Antonina's intertext with Jane Eyre is predicated on these moments of subjective liberation, often tied to the appearance of Gothic narrative cues within the text. I should add here that the chapter goes further into Gothic subjectivity by introducing an intertextual connection with Turgenev's Diary of a Superfluous Man, but for the sake of time, I will omit this. However, I'd like to articulate that numerous Gothic affective moments in Antonina revise the model put forward in Diary of a Superfluous Man, generating a framework that clearly demarcates oppressive and safe environments and centering the emotional experience of woman on her own terms. In Antonina, Although Gothic narrative markers identify both types of environments, feelings of horror, disgust, and above all fear characterize the external world, while reverent memories of the heroine's dead father color her inner life. In the end, however, it is her Gothic inner life that enables Antonina to persevere through her unhappy marriage, her stepfather's machinations, and her family's bankruptcy, and even to forge the space that enables her to correct her own tortured upbringing through maternal love for her daughters. As Monica Christina Sohr argues, the Gothic is especially potent as a conduit to an ideal world in which the ideology of normative femininity stands opposed. Unlike Jane Eyre, who seizes her own happiness, thereby throwing off the Gothic shadows that have oppressed her, Antonina embraces her Gothic inner life as a source of strength and resilience. Inner life creates a space of true belonging. Tours Antonina valorizes women having choices beyond the domestic sphere and creates an explicit, unfettered, imagined space for those choices to manifest. At the end of Antonina, the importance of Gothic subjectivity comes to the fore. It has created a safe space where the heroine can assert her will and thus avoid falling into the kind of role Tour decries in her 1858 review of Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte, one of subjugation and dependence. For Tour, the ability to create such a narrative space was a mark of talent and also validated women's writing. Tour's review of Gaskell's biography was a direct response to Turgenev, whose review of Tour's The Niece had made some strong gender-driven points around the dichotomy between feeling and objective truth, objectiveness. Turgenev's review of The Niece, and here I should say that this is a quote from Turgenev's review of The Niece that I was missing a slide apparently, so you got to see it early, but I'm going to talk about it now. Turgenev's review of The Niece may have lauded Antonina as, quote, pages that will remain in Russian literature, end quote, but nevertheless, his praise of the work's ability to arouse strong feelings fed into a paradigm that juxtaposed women's writing, characterized as laden with emotion, with men's writing, characterized as more objective. So in his review, Turgenev identifies women writers exemplified by Tour, as well as Yelena Gahn and George Sand, as having an undeveloped, unprofessional talent. And here's the quote. We can only claim that in female talents, and we do not exclude the highest of them, George Sand, there is something wrong, or nepravilnaya, non-literary, neliturnaya, running straight from the heart, not thought out in the end, end quote. And aside, this phrasing sounds remarkably similar to the critics who called early Gothic writing unwomanly that I mentioned earlier. Turgenev's review is perhaps not meant to be dismissive. However, in categorizing women's writing as emotional and focused on the subjective, and juxtaposing this category with a talent that exists independently of subjective experience and is connected with professional authorship, he ranks writers according to gender stereotypes and places women writers second in this hierarchy. Tour turned to professional writing as a means of supporting herself and her children after her husband's expulsion from Russia. By the time she was reviewing Gaskell's biography of Bronte, she was not only established as a novelist, but also employed as the head of the fiction section for Ruski Vestnik. Tour's comments on Bronte's career as a popular woman writer, who was respected for her talents, carry an additional message, a rebuttal to Turgenev's review of her own Bronte-inspired The Niece. Quote, for women whose lives are broken, and this is Tour writing, for women whose lives are broken, the writer's career opens a new horizon, gives them a new life. If reality refused them anything, or even worse, if it ruthlessly tore the best treasure of their soul and heart from them, they will recreate their own reality, fulfill their dreams in the fictional characters of the novel. In this way, reliving again the lost joys and sorrows. They will destroy, or at least soften and mitigate, their personal suffering. Writing offers more than satisfaction. It is a kind of reward, the rebirth of the whole being, end quote. Here, Tour, perhaps drawing from personal experience, connects the writer's craft with selfhood. The writer, and specifically the writer who is able to engage with the world of emotions, has the possibility for self-transformation. Tour's review seems to agree with Turgenev's valorization of women's ability to write feelings and to write from personal experience, but the subtext of her discussion of Bronte's craft is that women's writing is equally valuable as men's. Tour concludes her review with warm praise for Bronte's ability both to engage readers on an emotional level and to affect social change as a result of it. Quote, how many hearts throughout Europe responded to her complaints, doubts, suffering, indignation? Charlotte's heart beats and trembles on every page of her work and attracts the hearts of all readers. Whatever you say, the so-called subjective talents are especially attractive in this capacity. They speak more to the heart than to the mind. Touch a person's heart and he draws closer to correction and change. Touch the heart of people and be certain that you're doing good work and that your voice is not lost in the wasteland, end quote. For Tour, Deploying Gothic subjectivity in her prose provides a framework that has the potential to generate social change well beyond the boundaries of the text. Although written and published before these debates began in Russia, Antonina, in its Gothic intertext with Jane Eyre, and by engaging with Gothic subjectivity to articulate the need for alternative social models, puts forward a similar view. For Tor, the woman question is not a question of whether women should be educated, but a question of how Russian society must change to accommodate women's agency in its social fabric. This excerpt from chapter 6 of my book shows how analyzing Tor's use of Gothic subjectivity within Antonina sheds light on the broader discourse around women's roles that were ongoing in society at this time. Each of the later chapters of my book represents a case study of the way a particular strand of Gothic resonated with a specific social anxiety. Beyond the woman question, these include discourse around urban poverty, the threat of revolutionary terrorism, and the decline of the family and destabilization of the estate. Together, these later chapters create a broader picture of the Gothic's role in both depicting and mediating these anxieties. While my study touches upon social history, my focus is on questions of form and genre, and on how realism engages with Gothic poetics. The book thus concludes with a reflection on realism's evolution into modernism and the Gothic's role in this process. The development of Gothic realism requires a recalibration of the narrative of Russian literary history. When Gothic appears within the bounds of Russian realism, it is not simply grafted onto a realist foundation. Rather, Gothic enters the realist tradition from its inception as multiple writers exploit its devices, tropes, and plots. Gothic migrates into realism and then becomes assimilated. As my book shows, Gothic realism is a mode, an element in the realist toolbox that engages readers on an affective level. Its power is its function as a genre that specifically evokes affective responses of fear, dread, and anxiety. Realist writers sought to overcome the tension between art and life, and Gothic realism served as one path to mediate this tension. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katya. I'm going to now give the word to Katya Hokanson, please, as a discussant.
Thank you. So many thanks to Katherine Bowers for her fascinating overview of her recently published study, Writing Fear. I look forward to reading the whole study. It's striking that the Gothic, so closely associated with Anne Radcliffe's novels and seen as popular and lowbrow, and in fact unwomanly, became imbricated into realist forms in the work of writers who are considered anything but lowbrow or inappropriate. As Writing Fear's table of contents indicates, as Katya just outlined, the study encompasses a broad swath of the 19th century, from translations of Radcliffe to Pushkin and Gogol to Dostoevsky and Chekhov, and touches on broader cultural issues, such as the depiction of St. Petersburg, the woman question, revolutionary terrorism, and the country estate. Katya has already indicated in her talk the extent to which there has been an increase in the study of the Gothic in both Ukrainian and Russian literature. And she named numerous studies, and also Valeria Sobol, of course, having analyzed the Gothic as a mode of imperial discourse in Haunted Empire. I think here in particular of her highly memorable analysis of Lermontov's Taman. And clearly Writing Fear contributes to the ongoing project of delineating aspects of Russian realism in all its diversity. I found myself that Katya's first example of Gothic realism opened up new avenues of thinking about realist writing for me. The scene of young Nikolenka Irteniev looking at his dead mother's face in childhood is a famous and impactful one. I'd previously noticed the elements of the shiver and hair standing on end without necessarily associating them with the Gothic, and had certainly thought of the close description of the mother's face and the non-recognition of her face at first as indicative of defamiliarization. However, I find that Katya's argument that the Gothic in realism is associated with transgression and trauma to bring further illumination to the scene. Following the part that she quoted, following the narrator's shock and confusion at the sense of his mother being both alive and dead, the narration continues. I do not know how long I remained in that condition or what it was. I only know that for a time I ceased to be aware of my existence and experienced a lofty, inexpressibly delightful and sad enjoyment. Then a break. Then it continues. The door creaked and another chanter entered the room to relieve the first one. The noise roused me, and the first thought that came to me was that as I was not crying but stood on a chair in an attitude not at all touching, так как я не плачу, а стою на стуле в позе, не имеющей ничего трогательного, The chanter might take me for a heartless boy who had climbed onto the chair out of pity or curiosity, and I made the sign of the cross, bowed, and began to cry, end quote. As we know, the narration in the story is complex, but the depicted elements bring out Nikolinka's feelings of transgression, with the creaking door perhaps adding another Gothic element. He's guilty that he enjoys being unhappy, that he enjoys showing everyone that he's unhappy, and wonders also if others' reactions to his mother's death might also be just as insincere. I'd always associated these elements with the older narrator looking back to analyze his childhood thoughts and feelings and identifying insincerity in them along with other shortcomings. But looking at the scene through the lens of Bowers' analysis of Gothic realism provides another perspective through which to consider Nikolinka's transgressive thoughts and feelings. In terms of Katya's second example, I was very interested in the distinctions she draws in terms of gendered writing and in essence its defense. In her example comparing Jane Eyre with Tour's Antonina, I find it especially noteworthy that she chose to emphasize how Tour used Gothic elements essentially to rewrite scenes from Bronte's novel, changing the flickering fire from a terrifying and alienating entity to one that creates a warm and enveloping space, a safe environment for reading, that paradigmatic method of escape. At the same time, Tour used a review of a biography of Charlotte Bronte to rebuke Turgenev's perceived denigration of women writers' use of the subjective and the emotional, declaring that Bronte's ability to evoke emotional identification moved her writing beyond the world of reading into the real world, something that Tour also aspired to do with her own writing. Especially given the huge restrictions on women in regard to professions and other types of agency, the declaration about the potential for women's writing in all its particularity to create a broad impact on society and create the capacity to imagine alternative social models seems to me to have numerous implications for our larger 19V areas of inquiry in nonfiction as well as fiction. Bowers' study is an excellent reminder that literary movements and generic techniques, often while apparently passing from the scene, instead become incorporated in unexpected and sometimes unacknowledged ways until their continued existence is brought to our attention, creating new ways of reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya.
Thank you very much, Katya. Katya Bowers, do you want to respond to anything? Anything comes to mind right away? Otherwise, we're
yes. I want to talk a little bit more about Tour. So first, Katya, thank you so much for this. But with Tour, this was a very I had a limited amount of time, and so much of the chapter did not fit into what I was saying. And a larger part of this is a sort of in tandem analysis of Turgenev's use of the Gothic in Diary of a Superfluous Man, which I mentioned before. And what Turgenev does in Diary of a Superfluous Man, if you read the Gothic, is he kind of uses it to kill his heroine, to eliminate her voice from the text. And this is something that Tour was obviously fighting back against, or obviously responding to as well, in Antonina. And we can trace this through some of her letters from the time. We can trace this through some of her specific choices in Antonina. And I find it really interesting that this idea of the woman's voice coming to the fore and being supported through the Gothic in Antonina is in direct opposition to the Gothic being used to silence a woman in Turgenev's work. I find it really, really interesting, which is why this is my favorite chapter from the book. And I have to say, it has made me revise my opinion of Turgenev quite a lot. And I just wanted to respond with that, but thank you so much.
Perfect. Greta, please.
First of all, thank you, Katya, for that beautiful presentation. Your book is very exciting. I'm so glad that it's come out. My question is more about the Gothic interiority, and I wanted to ask it right away just because it continues on to what we've been discussing about Tour. I'm really fascinated by this idea, in part because my experience with the Gothic, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, my experience with the Gothic is mostly reading a bit of Anne Radcliffe, is that in Gothic fiction, interiority, psychological interiority tends to be de-emphasized in terms of the psychological interiority of the characters. There doesn't seem to be much of it. Am I wrong about, I might be wrong about that. So I'm curious about how a Tour sort of makes this transition from a genre that in which the psychological development of the characters, at least in my experience, doesn't seem to be prominent in the way it is in so much realist fiction and is in Tour. Sort of transforms the generic norms to make interiority significant. And also wanted to ask if you could give some more examples of how these sort of interior Gothic moments are marked in Tour. Like what gives them the Gothic flavor? Is it specific words? Is it or is it something else?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Greta. So first of all, within Anne Radcliffe's writing and within the broader, I guess it's like a subgenre called female Gothic that's been studied by Gothic scholars, there is a certain structure that appears in multiple novels. And this structure is, so within the female Gothic, very often, and especially in Radcliffean Gothic, you have a young heroine. She's very innocent. Horrible things happen to her. Like, who knows? She's kidnapped. She's imprisoned. Various things happen to her. And in the end, she's rescued. And in some cases, which I appreciate about Anne Radcliffe, she rescues herself. Other people are trying to rescue her, but she rescues herself. And one aspect of this is that as she's exploring, and this happens in multiple novels, as the heroine is exploring wherever she's imprisoned, whether it's a castle, whether it's a monastery, she will climb up to a point where she has a view out, like a perspective out, like into a tower or into a bell tower. And at that point, she will come to have a new perspective that is specifically instigated by her experience of the sublime in encountering this view that takes her out of her imprisoned space. And this moment of sublime is often linked to her, it gives her support for the travails that she has to go through moving onwards. So it becomes a moment of kind of subjective interior experience that she is able to tap into later. And it's specifically attached to the Gothic sublime. Now, and this is then contrasted with like the imprisoning aspects of her overall experience. But the within this kind of paradigm of the sublime moment and the new perspective, you have this idea that through interior life, you're able to escape from the confines of whatever is oppressing you. And this is something that I think that Tour is tapping into here. It follows this pattern very specifically. She's able to escape through reading. She's able to escape through kind of experiencing the outside world outside of the drama that she finds herself in the novel. And we find later on she has these dreams that are specifically marked as Gothic through the it's mostly through the use of language. Like you'll have, for example, the fear going into your spine. You'll have the specific moments that resonate very closely with Jane Eyre, with Gothic moments in Jane Eyre. And she has this dream, which is kind of horrible, where her dead father is resurrected, and she and her dead father have this very kind of like melancholy time together. And it's clearly a Gothic dream in the sense that she feels despair when she wakes up, but it's also clearly a dream that allows her to escape her own experience. And there's a couple of moments like this in Antonina, which I would say are Gothically marked. And it's interesting then that this Gothic inner life is juxtaposed with the outer life that's kind of imprisoning her. But this is a hallmark of female Gothic writing. I hope that has answered your question. Yeah.
Yes, I see a question from Hilda Hugenboom.
Mm-hmm.
Hilda, please. I need to unmute you. You are unmuted.
Hi, good morning, Katya from
Hilda.
Arizona. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. I learned so much, and I'm as fascinated as you are by the more we learn about Tour's interactions with Turgenev, the less good Turgenev looks. I agree with you entirely. So I have a question that deals with the the story, the inset story by Jean Lee about the countess who is, locked up in a prison room by her husband for being unfaithful. And this is a key trope. This is kind of how Radcliffe gets going. And it's a key kind of moment in a lot of texts. So Tour uses it, for example, in her last novel, Na Rubije. Kwashinskaya uses it in her major novel, Ursa Major. And so this is an imprisonment, I now realize, is devoid of all the kind of terror-inspiring details. It's more of a kind of a moral terror. And so I'm wondering what you've done with that, with those kinds of prisons. There's no sublime, there's no escape. And I think I mentioned to you at one point the tale by Izviekova, her first novel, Emilia, and it's the separation of mothers from their daughters. So I am so curious to hear what you'll say.
Well, I don't have a good answer for this. I haven't done much with this at all. I do talk a lot about the way that prisons appear in female Gothic novels and the idea of imprisonment, but I have not looked outside of this engagement with Antonina at this trope in a larger context. However, what I can say is that Mary Wollstonecraft was also writing Gothic novels, which I think is an interesting point. She wrote 2 of them, and Mary Wollstonecraft started writing Gothic novels precisely because she found that it was unconscionable for young, innocent women to be sheltered for most of their upbringing and then to be kind of thrust out into the world where horrible things can happen to them. And so she wanted to write examples of the horrible things that could happen to them that could be instructive before they're put into the world. And one of these was imprisonment. So the idea of being imprisoned in a house or imprisoned by a husband, something like this. And so this has been part and parcel of women's Gothic fiction from the 1790s. Interesting.
We have a comment here by Robin Miller. Thank you, Katya, for this fascinating presentation. Regretfully, I have to leave. So much to think about, including the weird moments of stark realism that also appear in the Gothic novels, especially those of Lewis and Maturin. This was so packed full of insights.
Yeah, that is something that I didn't have time to work on in my book. But I should say that this topic is huge. When I first started writing on this topic, when I was working on my dissertation, I started to see the Gothic everywhere. It was hard to constrain what I was working on. With the book, there were multiple things that I had to leave out. And one of these things is the curious way that Gothic novels can be realist or seem realist, which is, it's weird, but it's interesting. And I think there's definitely more of a relationship there. But this, once you start looking at Gothic writing and the way that Gothic writing merges with other genres, or the way that Gothic appears within just realism, you're quickly overwhelmed with examples. Once you start noticing it, it's everywhere.
Okay, I see Jonathan Payne.
Hi, Katya.
Hello.
Hi, Katya. Thank you for this stimulating talk. It sent me thinking in all sorts of different directions. And as you would suspect from me, one of them leads along the lines of the Gothic as a commercial device. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking back here particularly to the way in which it got used in England and in France, but I think didn't get used very much like this in Russia. Because if you look at the Gothic, it's actually a very powerful tool for expanding readership. People were drawn in by this in the English and to a lesser extent the French markets, and it's a real tool for expanding the reader market. Now, Russia, as usual, copies everything that happens in the terms of Western press development, but the readership just isn't there for it to act in the same way. And I wonder, it seems to me that this is perhaps a reason why the Gothic kind of died out so quickly in Russia, because, all you had was a bunch of critics who were saying this is terrible, and no sort of middlebrow or lowbrow audience to expand who were actually in England lapping it up. I don't know what you think about that. I mean, that would then feed into why Gothic imagery and Gothic tropes start to feed through into realism, which was sort of, in a sense, picking out what worked in the Gothic, i.e., melodrama and exaggeration, things that generate predictable reader responses. And then blends it in with the new genre that was also being imported with France, i.e. realism.
So I wrote an article that compares the Russian, French, and English book markets for Gothic fiction specifically. I'm going to put the link in the chat. And this is where the Radcliffe stuff appears. But specifically looking at the way that Radcliffe's novels are, you can trace the way that they're published, circulate on the French book market, circulate on the Russian book market, the way that different translators in Russia actually got more money if Radcliffe's name, if they were translating a Radcliffe novel. So often they would just say what they were translating was a Radcliffe novel. Publishers, if you look in book catalogs, publishers will say, oh, we got the latest Radcliffe novel, but it's obviously by someone else. And even in the same catalog, they'll have the same novel with different authors' names attributed to it in different advertisements from different booksellers. So it's really interesting stuff. But I think what we need to think about is that all of this stuff was coming into Russia as it happened later, and as it happened all around the same time. So you have this kind of Gothic wave that feeds into a situation, or I guess a book scene in the 1830s, where you have, for example, the works of Schiller being published alongside reprints of Gothic novels, being published alongside George Sand, being published alongside Balzac and Dickens. And this, because so Sand, Balzac, Dickens, they're all also influenced by the Gothic fiction that was published before. And so you have this kind of swirling around idea of what makes a book fun or enjoy or readable, or what sells a book. And a lot of these tropes are taken directly from Gothic fiction, which seemed to be all the rage at the time. And if you look even at like Pushkin, for example, and I love this quote by in Pikavaya Dama, where the Countess says, oh, do we have Russian books? But the books that she's describing are Gothic fiction. They're about like drowned bodies and like all of this stuff. And this is, it was, I think, circulating everywhere. But because when we look at literary history, we think, oh, well, Schiller, he was writing in the 1780s. No, he wasn't published in Russia until much later. Or if we look at, the different plays that were happening, different works that are coming out, they come out contemporaneously, and they all form part of this kind of cultural impetus towards this kind of like exaggerated, excited writing that we see very strongly in, for example, the young Dostoevsky. Why Dostoevsky of the 1840s is full of this stuff? It's because he knows it sells books, right? And he's trying to sell books. I hope that's answered your question.
But you're thinking along the same lines as me.
Yeah.
Valeria Sobel, Lera, please.
Thank you, Katya. Well, we have a Gothic doubling with two Katyas, haha. Did you plan that?
Joke. It was not planned, but we've joked about it already today. So.
I'm sure you did. Yeah. So obviously, Katya, I'm familiar with your book. I think you have a blurb from me, maybe not. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And we've collaborated so much, and it's been so much fun. So forgive me if I forgot. Maybe you've talked about it somewhere. Just as I was listening again to this, not again, but to this kind of beautiful presentation, I started wondering, just at the level of poetics or style, like, so the recognizable Gothic tropes, right, but placed in a different framework, different context of a realist-ish text. How do they feel? do they feel weird? Are they seamlessly incorporated? Do they feel archaic? I did only one analysis, a publication on Goncharov's a brief from this angle, because yes, you know, my work is in the early period of the 19th century, but on this Gothic mode in realism. And I try to make an argument that the seemingly archaic mode actually was an attempt to break away from realist conventions and constraints towards some different poetics, away from this kind of obsession with meticulous description and fullness and completeness of the world represented by realism. So I wonder what was your impression from so much material, how you already, of course, compared Tolstoy and Radcliffe, right? But just at the maybe stylistic level, what is different when this Gothic tropes, the same Gothic motifs are placed in such a different aesthetic and historical sort of contextually different works?
Thanks so much for this question. This is a great question. Yeah, so what I find is that some authors are very good at incorporating it, so it's kind of seamless. Tur is one of these. Like the Gothic in Tur, it flows very nicely into her prose. You wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. It just becomes part of the reader experience. With Dostoevsky too, the Gothic just becomes like we often, a lot of people have studied the Gothic in Dostoevsky, and it's because there is a lot of Gothic in Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky's use of the Gothic is kind of, it saturates a lot of his works. So for example, the moment when Raskolnikov is talking about his room and he says it's like a coffin, it's closing in on me, or the moment when Lisa Tushina tells Stavrogan, like, I love you, and it's our love is like a spider, and the spider is consuming everything around us. Like Dostoevsky has a way of incorporating these things so that they feel very normal and even kind of funny inside the fabric of his novels. But other authors, so Tolstoy, for example, if you look at childhood, as I did today, as Katya said, she had not noticed the Gothic there before, and it is because it simply appears as part of this, it becomes part of the mood. And maybe you're in the mood for, like, of course, if you're looking at the corpse of your mother, your hair is going to stand up on end a little bit, right? It's an uncanny experience, and so we expect maybe Gothic description there, Gothic representation. Other places, like when I talk about Gothic in Anna Karenina, which does not appear in my book, this was part of my book that was thrown out, although I should say I think Vadim Schneider does a really beautiful job of this in his book, Russia's Capitalist Realism, where he analyzes the Gothic within Anna Karenina. But there are these Gothic moments in Anna Karenina, and I think if I asked you what are the Gothic moments in Anna Karenina, you wouldn't be able to say, although we're all very familiar with Anna Karenina, because you don't think of that as being part of the fabric of the novel. My favorite Gothic moment from Anna Karenina is the moment when Anna is laying in bed and she sees her own eye, she sees herself from her own eyes. So she has like this out of body almost experience, and she's staring down at herself, and then her eyes are just like glistening and glowing in the dark. This is very weird, but we don't really notice that something's going on there. In authors like Goncharov, so I have looked at Oblomov, and in Oblomov, you do have this very clear Gothic shift. One moment is when Oblomov's dream happens in chapter, I think, 9. And the Oblomov's dream is a clear, I mean, it's clearly demarcated as a dream space. So the appearance of Gothic is not that startling there. But later in part 4, you have another kind of Gothic moment where Olga is having this kind of like fantasy. And again, it's demarcated as kind of fantasy. So it is a shift in tone, but you don't really, it's obviously demarcating like this kind of dreamscape. In the place where I find it most striking actually is in Zapiski Охотника, Turgenev's sketches, where he like everything will be fine. It will be very, he'll be describing like a sunset, he'll be describing something, and then all of a sudden night will fall and everything will become Gothic. And he starts describing like stones that he thinks are, that his narrator thinks are congregating, like a witch's cauldron. He starts describing the uncanny experience of like wet grass and kind of the glimmering white of the wet grass. And it becomes like this alternative landscape that is frightening. And so I think what I've learned from reading through all of this is that some authors are obviously better at incorporating Gothic than others in a seamless way. I think that Gothic is always tied to moments where we would expect something unsettling to be happening. And I think because of that, we don't always notice that there's a shift in tone in the writing, because it's describing what we would already expect. It gets into that idea of that relationship between reader expectation, reader anticipation, generic convention, and what the writer is trying to portray.
Katya, do you have a question? Would you like to?
Yes, and this is maybe a little not what you've been focusing on, but I was struck, and this might be partly because my husband is a film specialist who does a lot with horror film, but I was struck by the uses of sound. So the creaks and the screams. There's a later part right after that scene where the peasant mother comes in with the child, and the child screams. And then you have, there's a scream and the tour quotation, right? Or some kind of an outcry. I just was wondering to what extent, the representation of sound is something you've noticed a lot with the use of Gothic and realism.
It's the use of, that's a good question too. The use of sound is always there. The Gothic, when it appears, it's usually a sensory, kind of fully sensory experience. So you get sounds, you get vision, you get the visual, you get tactile representation as well. You get the kind of neurological sensation of what the experience of the Gothic is, kind of the tingling sensation or the hair standing on end sensation. So you get feeling as well. And it's all it's all tied together as part of this kind of like complete experience of this complete sensory experience. You do not get sound so much in the original Gothic genre. You get it somewhat, but it's not like you don't necessarily get as rich a soundscape as you do in a realist novel.
Could I ask a question as well, if there isn't? Yeah. Thank you, Katya. This was really interesting. I was thinking, I was wondering what your thoughts are, and not necessarily if it's in the book, but as somebody who's worked on this stuff so much, I'm wondering if you make distinctions between the different traditions of Gothic within the different kind of national literary traditions that you confront, right? So we have obviously the kind of the British Gothic, right, which is in some ways probably the kind of the origin of European Gothic, right? But then you do have a kind of like, figures like mentioned figures who like Balzac or Victor Hugo, who was so influential in Russia for a lot of our authors, and then of course the German Gothic, right, a little bit earlier maybe in the century has a kind of stronger influence, it seems, on the Russian lyric, let's say. And so I guess the question is, like, I know it's a very big question, but I was just curious to hear any thoughts that you might have about this. Do you feel like the Gothic gets inflected differently within these different literary traditions, and whether and relatedly, do you feel like the Russian reception of the Gothic is sort of predominantly English-centered, or is it sort of integrating everything, like you say, in this kind of swirl of contemporaneous reception, right? Or does it vary by author? So I was just curious to hear what you think.
So I think the the different national Gothic traditions are certainly different. Like Gothic or German Gothic is different than French Gothic, the École Frénétique, which is different than English Gothic. And if you look at a Schauerroman versus like the École Frénétique versus English Gothic, you can very clearly tell which is which, and not just because of the language, right? What I find in because of the history of translation, transposition, publication in the Russian context is that everything does get mixed up altogether. So you have, for example, I say that Radcliffe stands in as like a Gothic, for Gothic basically, and it's kind of a transnational Gothic because her name is appended to German Gothic novels, her name is appended to French Gothic novels, and because then these are all translated from the English, you get a very weird sense of what the English Gothic is on the Russian book scene. And so when people are talking about like the English novels, like the English muses, it's not clear what they mean by that. Like, I mean, it's clear what they mean by that. It's all Gothic, but it's not entirely clear what, like, whether the muses are English or what, if you're actually looking at this stuff. I do look in my book at Eugène Sue, and particularly physiological representation and the way that Gothic comes into physiological representation. I also look a bit at Der Geisterseher and the way that Der Geisterseher influences later things. And in terms of the English Gothic, I look at the two traditions, like the school of horror, the school of terror, and I delineate those. But the way that I read it, and I have a chapter on this, which is called A Russian Reader's Gothic Library, where I basically try and figure out what a reader of the 1830s would understand, a reader of the 1830s, 1840s would understand as Gothic. And it turns out they would understand everything as Gothic. Including like Hamlet, which is coming onto the Russian scene at the time, even though Hamlet, of course, is much earlier. I'm not sure we would necessarily call it Gothic. Shakespeare sure wouldn't have called it Gothic because Gothic didn't exist, right? Including things like
Bakhtin would.
Yeah, including things like Paradise Lost, right? Which is also coming on at the same time. But it's these things, they kind of like created, as you say, like a Gothic swirl that is tied to, as I say, I call it genre ecology, right? Where you have things that are recognizably parts of a genre, but not necessarily identifiable as specific elements of that genre. And so there's an understanding of what Gothic is that I think that Russian readers come to understand just from what's being published around them without necessarily being able to identify a specific Gothic novel.
I have a note from Carol Apollonia. Wonderful presentation. Thank you and congratulations, Katya. To which we can all add.
This book has been a Gothic journey.
Like so many other books are, I'm afraid, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, then we just thank Katya Bowers and Katya Hokanson for these wonderful presentations and look forward to reading, for those of us who haven't, look forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.